Hello and welcome to As We May Think. This is the third video I've done on web components, and it should be more of a return to what I did in the first video rather than the second one. I say that because in the first video I showed you exactly how to install Storybook so you could use it to help you build web components. But in the second video I showed you vanilla.js components, but I didn't go into a lot of detail on building them. Now I'm going to flip back to a quick overview to show you what the LitElement versions of the graph components I showed you in the last video look like, so that you can compare the vanilla JavaScript version against the LitElement version. But then I'm going to go in depth on exactly how you can use LitElement to build components and what it offers that makes this easier than doing the exact same thing entirely on your own using only JavaScript with no library. So let's take a quick look at a set of components built using LitElement, which are exactly the same functionally as the ones we looked at in the last video done with vanilla.js. The major thing you should take away from this is that the version without LitElement is, according to GitHub, 340 lines of source code. But the LitElement equivalent is only 199. That's about 40% smaller for the same thing. Why the difference? Well, a quick pass through the code reveals that all of the code that I wrote to handle attributes and properties and mapping between the two is simply not needed with LitElement. And there are more bonuses from using LitElement as well in how it handles templates. Let's dive in and actually start building components using it. In order to build a basic LitElement component, it's really not that different from what we did previously in the last video where I built a vanilla.js one in front of you. In this case, we're going to import a couple of pieces that we didn't need to import before. We're going to import LitElement itself, which is a superclass of the class we're going to build, and then we're going to import a thing called HTML. This is actually something called LitHTML, and I'll explain it more later. Alright, and then we want to pull all that from LitElement. Okay, that's all the imports we have to have. Then we're going to do a class. We're going to call this whatever we want, so we'll call it example. Extends LitElement. Okay. Now, custom elements, define, example, component, example. Stop it. Drop right there. You can drop the mic. You have a complete component. It's not a component that's going to do much of anything, but it does compile. It does work. Over here in the examples, which we're going to get to in a minute, I am importing this file into the stories of Storybook, so we know that it can be imported into the page and not break anything. You can tell that from going over here to Storybook. Storybook still works. So all is well from that standpoint. It's just that this component doesn't actually do anything. Everything we do from here on out is going to be making the component actually do something. But already, the browser is doing several things for us. I tried to make this point last time, but I'll kind of hammer down on it a little bit. Already, we've told via the custom elements define, every time it sees an element named example-component in the HTML, it should automatically create an instance of this class and then connect the two to each other. That's it. That's all it should do. In this case, there's nothing else to do. But we're going to now go in and fill in all of those bits and pieces we need to make it actually do something. And most of those bits and pieces focus on two major areas. One is the attributes and properties. Attributes and properties help us get data in. The other bit is rendering. We need to be able to render something so that the user sees a user interface in which with which to interact. That is what we're going to focus on now. And the framework we're going to use to focus on that, well, I thought, hey, React is kind of popular, so let's look at React's examples. So let's go here. And this is the React homepage. On the React homepage, they have some examples. They've got one called a simple component, another one called a stateful component, an application, and a component using external plugins. 4 basic examples. What if we just built those same 4 examples and kind of compared and contrasted how they look in a web component using LitElement versus the exact same thing for React? That should be a good test. So what I did was I put in 4 stories under this generic story group, which is React examples as LitElement. I put in 4 specific stories, each one of which has a brief that describes what that particular example does over on the React site. Now we're just going to do the exact same thing in terms of filling in the component to make this work. So if you come back over here, you'll see that if we do look at the stories, each one of those right now just has the class. It has a brief here that explains what it does. You saw those on screen. And then it has an instance of this new element, this new component right here that's already referred to. Here's timer example, here's to-dos example, and here's markdown example. So they already exist in the HTML. As soon as we provide a component with that name, the browser will hook the 2 of them together for us. We don't have to do anything else. So let's actually start filling them in. The first example was what we were working on earlier. This is kind of our framework for all of these. So I'm going to actually copy and paste it to each of the examples. There we go. So now all 4 have a basis for being ready to use. All right, let's get back to the first one though, because we don't want to work on this one yet. Let's look at a simple example first. This is not much of anything. This is you saw a component almost identical to this one previously in the last video where I talked about it with Vanilla.js. Here we're going to create a render function. Looks like I had a stroke there. And it's going to return an instance of this HTML thing we see up here. Now, that's going to take a second to explain. LitHTML is used by LitElement. LitHTML is a piece of software that they developed to give us some of the same kind of functionality you see in React. React has virtual DOM, which is an attempt to make updating the HTML faster whenever we make changes to the variables that are going into it, to make that whole re-rendering process easier and faster. We want that exact same thing in a lot of our components, so they provide it via LitHTML. And it looks just like a template literal. If you've ever used template literals before, that's what it is. But in this case, we're going to say hello, and we're going to say name. Now, where does name come from? In this case, what we're going to do is we're going to get name from the attributes on this component. So this.get attribute name. So theoretically, that would go, no matter how many instances there are of the component on the page, all of them would work, because each one could have its own name on an attribute, and each one, in each case, that attribute for this would get just that one particular instance, because one of these classes gets created for every one of those components. So let's make the name match, and let's make this other name match as well. I believe we can just do a rename here. Nope, not that kind of refactoring, John. There it is, rename symbol. Sorry, too much WebStorm there. I believe this was called, what was the brief? Storybook's already compiled it. So what's the issue? Oh, we got an extra. There we go. Sorry about that. My apologies. Okay. It's very unhappy about having several things named example element. Sorry, that's what I get for cutting and pasting. I had multiple components, all of which had exactly the same name. The browser took one look at that and said, hey, sorry, you can't have multiple components all with the same name. And it wasn't happy. So I had to go fix that real quick. That's something to be careful about. But as soon as we did fill out this component, this started working. However, we're not making full use of LitElement's ability to handle attributes. I'm going and getting this attribute manually. That's not really a great way to use it because LitElement has good support for this. So let's actually go in here and let's use the ability to set up mappings between properties and attributes, something we're going to come back to and talk about quite a bit later. So static get properties. All right, this function needs to return an object. That's, however, not quite good enough. We needed to have something on there to name what the given properties and attributes that we're interested in are. Well, we know one. It's called name. So we're going to put one on here, and we're going to say type is string. All right, save that, and we're done. Now, the interesting part about this is now LitElement should go get the attribute, pull it, put it onto a property of the object, and we should be able to get it just like this. Let's try it. Oh, helps if you make it function. Worked perfectly. First time. Don't tell anybody any different. Well, as you can see, during live coding, I make mistakes, but nothing that's not too hard to figure out. So other than forgetting to put any parentheses here, this function simply returns an object that specifies an attribute we're interested in and a corresponding property at the same time. It pulls the attribute, puts it into a property ready for us to use so that we can say this.name in here and use it in our rendering function. Let's go look at the React equivalent, and I think you're going to find it's very similar and yet in some ways not similar. Let's look at the React version of this same thing. All right, here's how React does it. There's a render. It's returning something, but oddly enough, it's returning where we return a template literal string, which is what this is. The backticks are giving us a ES6 template literal, and we're putting something into that. Theirs isn't a string. They're actually embedding HTML or something very similar to HTML in the middle of their function. This is what is called JSX by React. I think it's terrible. And the React folks tend to be really, really defensive about it. You'll notice the huge, bold JSX is optional and not required to use React. That's true. Ask anybody you know who uses React if they know anybody who doesn't use JSX. Yes, the fact that you can do without it, that's true. You're not going to meet hardly anybody who isn't doing it. The downside of this is that it kind of weds you to some kind of system to compile this to valid JavaScript from now on. You will always have to use TypeScript. You will always have to use JavaScript like Babel something to recompile this in order for JSX to work, because obviously this is not valid JavaScript as it is. Just having HTML in the middle of a function is invalid JavaScript normally. So I'm not crazy about that. It's not a showstopper. Obviously, for a lot of people, they're okay with that for what they get, which they're happy to get a good component system. But immediately you'll notice that there's a very simple mapping here. There's a render function. It puts in some divs. I actually didn't even bother to put in the divs. I'll go ahead and do that right now. Okay, now mine's just like theirs. Okay, puts in divs. I could even have them on different lines if I want to, just like they did. I guess I'll do that too. Make mine match theirs. Okay, still working. We'll double check that. Yep, just still working. So now, here's where things are different. All I had to do to get the two to connect up was I had to load the JavaScript that contained the component, and then I had to make reference to the component in my HTML. You saw that before, where I actually had, in the story, a reference to hello-world as an element. Here, they have to call react-dom.render, which basically says, here's a chunk of HTML. Find this spot in the document and put the component there. And by the way, here's the name that you'll need. You don't do any of that in Web Components. The browser does it all for you, which is good because it means that no matter how many there are on the page, they'll all automatically get wired up. And even if they get added later by JavaScript, they'll get wired up. Even if they get removed later via JavaScript, everything will work fine. And if you add it some other way, let's say you go into the dev tools and actually just change the HTML on the page, it'll just create the component after you finish typing. It just works because it's built into the browser. So to me, this and this are kind of, well, this is a code smell. I think JSX is a bad thing. This is no longer needed. You don't need this anymore. Ideally, what you would do is exactly what our code looks like. It would go and simply, helps if I actually show you the code. It would just simply have this. This is part of the HTML. That's a normal element. As soon as that is a real component in the browser, which is what we did by adding a component, boom, it gets wired up and it starts working. That is, to me, the better way of doing things. It's better in that respect than React, better than AngularJS, Angular, or Vue, or any of the other ones you might want to name. However, you can easily imagine a circumstance under which somebody just took React and rewrote it slightly so that this JSX generated, it just basically used a web component underneath the covers. It just skipped all this portion of things and everything else was still exactly the same. There may well be a future version of React.component that does exactly that. And if you took a smaller code base, something like Preact, that would probably be even simpler in Preact to get that to function. So there's no reason that can't come along. I don't intend to just sit here and bash on React because I don't think it's worth it. I think React is just fine. A lot of people like it very well. But let's just continue on with the examples, and let's try the next one, which is a stateful component. We have a brief for that one as well. And it basically says there's a class called timer. It renders a div with seconds and then a state value for the seconds. State initializes to 0 and it ticks upward once a second. And finally, the custom element is named timer example. So let's go fix ours to match that. Okay, first we know we need to have this back. We know we need a render. we know it returns HTML. All right. Now it should be actually working. Let's make it, let's rename this again. I believe they called it timer example. Okay. Nope, just timer, sorry. My apologies. Alright, now it matches theirs. I believe they said it was seconds, and then this dot seconds. Now that's not going to actually work yet because we don't actually have a property on this class called seconds, but we'll add one. Alright, let's see. And whoops, look at that, it's already displaying something. We said we wanted it to be a div around it, so we'll do that too. Alright, we'll save that. And then we know we want let's try making it a function this time, not make that stupid mistake again. Alright, now at this point, there is a seconds value. There we go. Now, we want it to start at 0. So, how do we do that? Well, we can come into our constructor. Now, if you're not already comfortable with the things that make up a class, you will get some of it just from watching me work. If you haven't used ES6 classes before, you haven't used the class designator here, you haven't had constructors, member functions, there's a bunch of things you probably haven't encountered yet. You haven't encountered static functions. That's absolutely fine. You can watch along and then learn it as you go, or you can go take a little bitty course. I'm sure there's plenty of stuff around on how classes work in modern JavaScript. It's really not that complicated, but do know, if you don't already, that a constructor, every time a new instance of this class is going to be created, the constructor is going to get called first. And specifically, since we're inheriting from LitElement, our class gets a lot of its functionality from LitElement. When we do our constructor, we're going to call LitElement's constructor first before we do anything else. So now let's do this. This dot seconds. Alright, so all this did was give LitElement a chance to get everything all set up. Then we come in and we set this property that should already be in existence by the time we get to right here. Sure enough, there's our seconds at 0. Now we need something. Now we need to do something that is going to cause it to automatically update on a regular basis. So we could do this. We could do this a variety of places. I'm going to just do it right here. I'm going to say basically set interval, and we're going to give it a timer handler. Hopefully I'm remembering how to do this correctly. And we're saying this dot seconds plus plus. Looky there. Now let's compare that real quick against the React equivalent. Alright, here's their version of the same thing. Well, not surprisingly, they are calling their super because they do have a parent. They're setting the initial state. They're setting it to 0. They've got something to update the state. We're doing that more directly. We're not doing set state to do it. we could do that, or something similar to it, but we're not at this moment. And here's where they're doing on a what is basically a lifecycle event. Every component system typically has lifecycle events, which are points at which you get called to say that a particular component got mounted or unmounted or whatever, basically came into existence. In our case, we know that there's a constructor. That's a point at which we're getting added to the overall page. Our constructor is a fine place to do this particular thing. They did do a thing that I forgot to do, which was clear it away at the end. So let me do this interval. So this would give us a chance to get rid of it. The components do get destroyed, and there is a chance for us to get rid of the interval timer at that point. I'm going to have to look that up real quick, so you're going to see a pause here for just a second, because I have to go look up what the lifecycle event is to use for LitElement. It's going to be something very similar to the constructor. And we're back. Turns out that there's no actual lifecycle specific to the removal of a component. There is just the regular one that is provided for you by the browser, so we can use disconnected callback. And disconnected callback is going to get called normally. So we're going to do a super here to make sure that the original version in LitElement gets called. And then we're going to do a clear interval of this interval. All right, that should take care of getting rid of the interval timer whenever we let's try that again. That should be better. Okay. So now anytime this particular component gets removed, it should automatically clear the interval timer, and whenever one gets created. So actually, let's have two separate ones. I like that idea. Let's do that real quick. I'm getting into so much trouble from doing things on the fly. It's always a bad idea, and yet here I am doing it. Timer example. Okay, now I have two on the page. Haha. And look at them click along in time. Oh, I know what we can do. Here, let's do this. Let's do, you're going to like this. Equals 55. Boo-yah. So now you're seeing several things all at once. One is that you're seeing that the attribute is, even though I didn't wire up the attribute at all, the attribute is getting handled automatically. I specified it as the attribute and property all in one when I did the get properties. So there is a seconds thing. By assigning something to the attribute, it automatically went into the property. It had an initial value that was set in the constructor, but the attribute value overrode it on this second one. And furthermore, now you can see that there are two independent objects, and they are both clicking along independently from one another. So you could have as many of those timers as you wanted, each one of which doing different time. Oh, good. Well, let's just leave that. What the heck? We'll leave that as it is. All right, let's move on to the third example, which is what they call an application. Let's see how far we can get on this today. And then the next video, we're going to talk a lot more about templates, and especially we're going to talk not just about templates, but we're going to talk about properties and attributes and try to explain them in such a way that it's not complicated. It's really not. If you've been using HTML for any number of years, the relationship between the two is very clear-cut. I can make it simple by referencing a couple of things you're probably already used to using, like an input. So let's go on and do the next one, which is right here. All right. Let's see what the brief said about this one. Okay, so it should be called to-dos example. Let's rename this to To-Do app. Okay, we're all good on that. Let's make sure there's a renderer here. Let's return HTML. This is a tag template. Literal. Okay, I haven't really explained tag template literals, but that's something that's going to come up in the next one, as well as some other nifty stuff. Actually, let's take a quick side trip here. I'm terrible about these, but let me point out something in Visual Studio Code that I use all the time. See this particular plugin here, ES6 string HTML. I use this and I depend upon it. So you see this right here. We have to have this for LitElement. But let's say I had a regular string here. If I do this, it's not syntax highlighted, is it? I mean, it doesn't know that this string is HTML. There's nothing to tell it that. But because LitElement requires this to be on there anyway, it says, oh, hey, you know what? I bet that's HTML and I can syntax highlight it for you. And you'll actually see the same thing happen in another spot if we go look at the stories. And I'll do that right now. So if I go look at the stories over here, they also are a template literal. They're not a tagged template literal. So the strings thing I showed you a second ago, that plugin, allows me to just put a comment right before the template literal, and that tells it, oh, you want me to highlight it, rather than just treating it like it's a regular text string. You've got HTML in there. This is an awesome plugin. I really encourage you to install ES6 string HTML. Okay, huge digression aside. Let's come back and go back to the app. All right, so now we should see not much of anything yet. Let's see, it's got to have a div, it's got to have an H3 to do H3. Okay. All right, it's got that much already. Let's see. Okay, and then it's got a subcomponent. So we're actually going to do two components here. We're not going to do just one. We're going to do two. There's a second one called to-do list. Okay, let's do that real quick. So even though we are not building all of it right away, let's go ahead and just wire up the basics. Extends LitElement. It also has a renderer. And let's see. It's got... Oh, it's got an unordered list. Okay. UL. All right, that doesn't actually have any contents yet, but that's fine. Oh, and let's go ahead and create it down here. Custom elements. Oh, what should this one be called? Oops, it's not happy with something. Oh, you can't have some. Let's see if we'll give it a temporary name and make it work, and then fix it right. Sorry, Storybook doesn't like it if your stuff does not compile and all work correctly. So let's come back over here. You know, it doesn't actually say what that should be called. Okay, that's all right. Doesn't matter. We'll just call it to-do list. Now, you're going to love this. Remember, this is just HTML in here, which we can put a few string template literal stuff onto. But for the most part, it's just HTML. So that means, since we just created a new component down here and here, let's put it right here. There we go. But you know what? I need to pass those to-dos in there somehow. So let's go ahead and I'm just going to put in a static get properties return. What would we call that? We'll call it the list. Nah, we'll call it to-dos. Nope, doesn't like that, does it? Oh, did it again. Wow, that's sad, John. All right. And there's to do. If we actually look at this, and I think we ought to do that for a second, let's actually bring up the debugger on this storybook, and let's look at it real quick here. And you'll notice here is the stuff. Here's the to-dos example. This is our component. There's a shadow root, and then it's already starting to insert all the bits and pieces. It put in the bits that we've filled in for our renderer. It put in the new component. That new component automatically got wired up to its stuff. So everything is working. See, here's the unordered list right there. Even though that we don't have any data yet, it's already starting to do its job because the browser's doing most of it for us. Let's see now. All right, so we're going to say we have all right. So I've called super again. You always have to do that whenever you have a constructor. So we're going to say we want this dot to-dos. That's an empty array. Okay. And then we're going to actually wire this up to get passed down to the child. Let's see. Let's put one in there just to see what happens. John. See what I forget? It's not making it down. Oh, yes it is. Probably is making it down just fine. Let's actually make it do something. So now we're going to show you something a little more advanced than what we've seen thus far. You've seen a lot of cases where I use the classic this and simply put the name of a variable in there. We want to do more in this particular case. We want to say this dot to-dos map. So we want to take every single to-do, quote unquote, in the list, and we want to return something that can actually be rendered for it. And again, we're going to use the HTML tag template literal. All right, and we're going to say list item. Will this work? I don't know, but I think it will. And with that, I think we're going to call this video done. Hey, if you liked this, please click like, click subscribe, and tell your friends. I would really like it. I would appreciate it so much. And please come back next time, because what we're going to be doing in the next video is going through another example from the to-do, or actually we're going to finish this one up. There's a tiny bit left to do on this one. We're going to do the next React example, and then we're going to do some more examples to show some of the breadth and depth of what LitElement can do. There's a whole lot it can do, and it's really pretty neat. Please come back. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.